Shalom, welcome to Lights of the Nations. We're continuing with our study in the Rambam, Maimonides, halachot Beit Habechira, laws of the Beit Hamikdash, and we had something of a break for the Passover season. I think that today we may actually manage to finish Perek Bet. We have 4 more halachot in the second chapter of this great work about the temple. This chapter, as we know, has been focusing on the altar, the main altar, the outer altar, the altar of the offerings in the Holy Temple. And the next chapter, chapter 3, we're going to see is going to be dealing with the major vessels of the sanctuary. So we have 4 more entries in this perek. We're up to halacha Tet Zayin now. No, I'm sorry, we're actually up to halacha Tet Vav, number 15. And we have learned already, we learned previously about the structure of the ramp. We've learned in detail about the structure of the altar. We've learned in detail about the height of the altar and the various components. And then more recently, we learned about the ramp and the smaller ramps off to the side. We learned about the structure of the ramp and also about the feature of the space between the ramp and the altar. And at the side of the ramp, on the floor of the courtyard, on the western side of the ramp, there were 2 tables which are actually described to us in the Mishnah. And Maimonides begins halacha number 15 as follows: Ushnei shulchanot hayu b'ma'arav hakevesh. There were 2 tables on the western side of the ramp. Echad shel shayesh shenotnin alav et ha'evarim. One of these tables was constructed of marble, and this table was used to hold the various parts of the offerings that needed to be prepared in order to be brought to the altar. So the pieces of the offerings were placed on this marble table. Ve'echad shel kesef shenotnin alav klei hasharetz. The other table was made of silver, and that was used to place upon it the sacred vessels that were used by the Kohanim for the temple service. So let's understand this halacha a little bit more specifically. Again, we've said that to the west of the ramp, it's actually, we're speaking about the area between the hall, the ulam, the hall of the sanctuary, and the altar. There stood 2 tables, one of silver, one of marble. This actually comes from a Mishnah in Tractate Shkalim. Now, this first table that we mentioned, which is the marble table, actually has a nickname in another Mishnah in Tractate Tamid, which of course is the tractate that speaks about all of the details pertaining to the daily offering. And there this table is called the table of fats, and that is the table upon which are placed the various parts of the offerings, of the tamid and the musafim, the additional offerings as well. And it's specifically made out of marble because marble does not conduct heat, doesn't become hot, and thus the parts of the offerings would not become overly hot and become spoiled before they are brought to the top of the altar, for that would in fact render that part of the service invalid. The other table, the silver table, is used simply to receive the vessels that are being used in various parts of the service by the temple, by the Kohanim when they are not in use. The silver table is designed for the klei sharetz, which were removed from the chamber of the vessels. And this really is simply so that the vessels would not be placed directly onto the floor of the courtyard, which would be not a respectful way of treating the vessels, even in between their use in the temple. And that really is halacha tetvav, number 15. Halacha number 16 tells us an important concept of the structure of the altar again. Actually, earlier on, the Rambam told us about the construction of the altar, but here he is actually going to give us some information that he hasn't emphasized until this point. Kishabonin hamizbeach, halacha tet zayin, number 16. Kishabonin hamizbeach, bonin oto kulo atum kimin amud. When we construct the altar, it must be constructed totally sealed, like a pillar. In other words, atum, this word atum means sealed, hermetically sealed. It is not hollow. Ve'ein osin bo chalal klal, and there is no space to be made in it. It is not to be made with any sort of empty space. Ella mevi avanim shlemot gedolot uktanot, but rather large and small hewn stones or raw stones are brought. Umevi sid vazefet vekonya, and then they would bring like lime and tar, and some say this word konya is like a type of molten stone. Umemache v'shofech letoch malben gadol kimidato uboneh va'oleh. And basically, this means that a kind of like a frame, a large frame, the shape of the altar was made out of wood, and this was filled with these materials. It was filled with the stones, and the small spaces in between the stones were filled with this sealant that was made out of sid, which is lime or lime wash, and tar, and molten stone or lead, filled up the gaps between the larger stones, poured into this large frame made out of wood, the size of the altar, and ascending up. And v'notein betoch habinyan guf shel eitz or even bekeren dromit mizrachit kimidat hayisod. The same type of thing would be done for the yisod, for the foundation. A smaller frame, that shape would be built out of wood or stone in that corner, according to the attributes of the yisod, the foundation. V'chein notein betoch kol keren v'keren ad sheyashlim habinyan v'yasir hagufim shebetoch habinyan. And so too, regarding every corner of the altar, this is how it would be built until the entire structure would be filled and complete. And these frames would be removed. Kedei shetishaer keren dromit mizrachit below yisod. These frames would be removed so that the shape of the altar would be revealed, including the fact that the southeastern corner does not feature the protrusion of the yisod, as we learned earlier, the foundation. V'yisharo hakranot chalulin, and the horns of the altar themselves would remain hollow. So in this halacha, and this is basically in line with the Talmud in Tractate Zvachim, we have this very specific tradition and description. Again, this is one of the things that are gained from a study that is undertaken together with the sources of the oral tradition. One comes to the verses in Exodus, for example, that describe the altar, and one does not understand how this was built. Just yesterday I received an email from a viewer who was asking about the prohibition that he noticed in the book of Exodus about not walking up steps to the altar. And he wrote a letter saying, well, if they weren't allowed to walk up steps, how did they get to the top of the altar? And did I not see on your site pictures of steps? And I realized, of course, that he had no no knowledge, hadn't been following these lessons, had no knowledge regarding this tradition. And I guess when a person looks at the illustrations very quickly and sees an incline up to the top of the altar, one might think that it's actually steps. He says, if there's a prohibition against walking up steps so that your nakedness is not exposed, why do I see steps on your site? And I explained to him, you didn't see any such thing. If you look closely, you'll see that it is a ramp, an incline that gradually ascends. But the point is, I realized after I read this that how is he to know that there is a ramp? It's actually not mentioned. It's actually not mentioned specifically in the Torah itself. And how much more so, all of the details that we are studying in this halakha regarding how the altar is actually to be constructed, these things are not really discernible if one would only be studying the verses of the Torah itself. And another example, as we have had many, and as we never cease to use to illustrate the inexorable bond between the written and the oral Torah. So, there is certainly a very exacting recipe for how every one of the mitzvot of God are to be performed and how it was done in the time of the temple as well. So here, the Rambam again codifying the approach to how the altar was built according to what is described in Tractate Zvachim, describing the fact that the altar itself is a sealed structure without any spaces, and describing the fact that stones were brought, actually, again, in Masechet Zvachim, it's clarified that the best type of stones that were obtainable were those that were from the ocean or were from rivers, some of them larger, some of them smaller. These stones were placed into the type of frame that was described, and then the three materials that the Rambam mentions here, Sid, Zephet, Konya, these are materials that were used to fill the spaces between the stones. And again, Konya, an unusual word. Our explanation is actually that it was molten lead. So these things, the whitewash and the lime, the lead and the tar were actually mixed together, and water was added as well. And this is what was used in order to fill up the spaces. This whole concept is also beneficial in our understanding how the altar was built in the numerous locations when the tabernacle was taken apart and packed up and moved from one place to another. There actually was a frame that was used in order to obtain the exact shape and size in each location. So, moving on now, this was halakha number 16, and in halakha number 17, the Rambam teaches us Arba kranot shel mizbech v'yisudo v'ribo'o me'akvin. The four corners, which we refer to as the four horns of the altar, and the foundation of the altar, and its squareness, the fact that it must be square, these three details of the altar are me'akev. That is a halachic concept. It means that they are an impediment to the fulfillment of the requirement if they are not present. And the root of this word, ikuv, which literally means to hold something back, this is a very important idea in Torah law, that every mitzvah that we fulfill, there may be aspects of the mitzvah which are li'ikuva, they are me'akev. That means that they would be an impediment if they would not be present in the execution of the mitzvah. And then there may be other details which are not li'ikuva. In other words, they don't impede its fulfillment, but they just make the mitzvah more desirable or perhaps more kosher in a way, in other words, more first class, our first desire to do it as best as possible with the greatest splendor and with the greatest honor of the mitzvah. But if sometimes under extenuating circumstances, let's say certain details of a mitzvah cannot be fulfilled, well, the Torah scholar in every situation needs to know which aspects of a given mitzvah are absolutely intrinsically imperative in order for that mitzvah to be fulfilled, and which aspects, unfortunately this time, perhaps we would have to do without. So I take this opportunity now, since this is the first time that we run into this concept, and we're mentioning it, to explain how this would apply to many situations. And this is part of the whole body of knowledge of Torah. You know, when we talk about Torah teachers and Torah scholars and how there's so much information that they have to be able to process, and how the whole process of coming to a rabbi for an opinion, for a psak halacha, for a decision, a legal rendering in Jewish law, how this is such an important thing and how there's so much at stake. It's because sometimes the rabbi has to use all of his knowledge and his experience in precedents as well to know that perhaps this time it has to be different. An example might be how we find in Jewish law the concept that there is a best way of doing something and there is a second best way of doing something. That's called lichatchila, the best way, b'diavad, second best if you have no choice. And then there's also a concept called shat hadchak, which means a time of distress, which means a situation of duress. And then perhaps in a situation of duress, you can't even do the mitzvah, with practically any of the details. Well, what is the bare requirement of the mitzvah? An example of when this concept is used quite often in contemporary Jewish life might be a soldier in the army who is not his own boss, doesn't have his own time, and is already involved in a broader mitzvah of protecting his people, and therefore he doesn't always have the ability to do everything as best as possible, so he needs to know with precise halachic guidance what he can do in order for him to be able to fulfill the mitzvah. Other examples might be when a person is being persecuted, there are persecutions, and he has to be in hiding. Or let's say another example, a very common example, would be where a person doesn't have the budget, doesn't have the money to fulfill the mitzvah as best as possible. So all of these are important principles in Jewish law. And here the Rambam is saying as follows. He's saying, you can't have an altar and call it an altar if it doesn't feature four corners, the foundation where it belongs, and the perfect squareness. And then goes on to say, V'chol mizbeach she'ein lo keren yisod v'kevish v'ribua. Any altar that does not have the horns, the foundation. Here he goes on to add in also a ramp, and also the element of squareness. It is pasul. It is unfit, invalid. Sha'ar batan me'akvin, because these four details impede the fulfillment of the legality of the altar. In other words, they are intrinsically imperative for it to be called an altar altogether. And what's interesting here, and what's actually very important for us to understand, is as we can see, the Rambam here so far has not mentioned the size of the altar at all. He's mentioned these attributes of the design of the altar, but why hasn't he mentioned the side? After all, we spent a great deal of time earlier on talking about the size of the altar. Now he goes on to say, Aval midat arko, umidat rachbo, umidat komato, enan me'akvin. But the exact measurement of its length and its width and its height are not intrinsically imperative. Vehu shalo yivchot me'ama al ama berum shalosh amot kishiur mekom hamaracha shel mizbach hamidbar. And that is to say, as long as it's not less than 1 square amah and a height of 3 amot, which is the minimalistic requirement, because that is the exact amount of the area of the maracha, which means the top of the altar where the offerings were actually placed, in the era of the mizbeach that was used in the desert tabernacle. So he says, because we've learnt, after all, that the altar is 32 amot by 32 amot, did we not? And here he's saying literally, beferush, means explicitly, at the end of this halacha, number 17, that it should not be less than 1 amah by 1 amah at a height of 3 amot, which would be the size of the maracha portion of the altar in the time of the desert tabernacle. So let's explain this a little clearly. Basically, the intention of our master Maimonides in this halacha is that lichatchila, first choice, best way to fulfill the halacha, is that the mizbeach must be erected at a size of 32 amot by 32 amot, which is already what we have learned earlier. So no, you're not hallucinating. That is what we learned. It has to be 32 amot. However, bidiavad, which means if there's really no choice and if there are extenuating circumstances, whatever they are, it is also possible to build a smaller mizbeach, as long as it has the corners, the foundation, and the squareness, and the ramp is the fourth thing he adds. In other words, the Rambam here is doing a great service to the Jewish people as usual, and instructing us in the perpetuity, in the relevance, and in the realism of the Torah and Halacha, which is, let's say, you might be in a situation now where you can't build a Mizbeach that large. Well, what can I get away with and still satisfy Hashem? What can I get away with, excuse me for that terminology, what can I do minimalistically if I have no choice and still be able to call it according to the Torah, because it's not up to me. It's up to the definition of the Torah. Hashem is the master of the house, right? What would he still call a mizbeach? So he says, according to this tradition, according to understanding how this is all worked out, based on the mizbeach in the desert, that would be enough. And I'll give you an example of how this might be very apropos. Let's say it's time to bring the Passover offering, and at the very last minute, we receive permission from the authorities that we will be able, in fact, to build a makeshift altar on the exact spot on the Temple Mount, but that it shouldn't be too obtrusive and it shouldn't be too high profile, because that will upset the current occupiers, illegal occupiers of the Temple Mount. And so the prime minister says to the chief rabbi, Rabbi, what's the smallest altar you could build and satisfy our people with a Passover offering? And so the rabbi could know, well, it's really supposed to be a towering structure of 32 cubits by 32 cubits, but fortunately the Rambam tells us that it could still be a mizbeach, an altar, even if it's only 1 amma at a height of 3 amot. So this is a good example of when this halacha would really have a very good application. So this section of the Talmud in Masechet Zvachim, in Tractate Zvachim, is basically talking about the most minimalistic attributes possible for the altar. Actually, Rashi there in the Talmud seems to indicate that his view of the minimal size of the altar would be 5 by 5 amots, which actually is the exact size of the mizbeach in the tabernacle. However, obviously, the Rambam himself here certainly seems to imply that the way he understands that passage in Masechet Zvachim, again, these are the great people, how they understood their predecessors, the rabbis of the Talmud, he understood it that the minimal measurement of the altar is not, as Rashi says, which is the exact size of the altar in the tabernacle, but the exact size of the makom maracha, which is the top part of the altar, which is an amma by an amma. So, let us go on quickly to halacha number 18, which is actually the last halacha in this chapter. And here the Rambam tells us, Mizbeach shenefgam mi binyano, an altar which became blemished. And earlier on, if you recall, we studied in the first chapter in halacha number 17 regarding an altar that is blemished. But here, the Rambam is referring to an altar which has some sort of blemish, some sort of nick in its outer coating, in that solution which is coating the cracks. So he says, Mizbeach shenivgam mibinyano, an altar which has a blemish in its outer coating, im nifgam mibinyano tefach pasul. If a whole tefach, that measurement that we learned about, is blemished, has become chipped or broken, then that would become invalid. Pachot mitefach, however, if the blemish in the outer coating of the altar would be less than a tefach, kasher, the altar is still valid. Vehu shelo yiyeh banishar even piguma, so long as there isn't pigam shel pachot mitefach b'mivneh hamizbech eno posel hamizbech. The Rambam tells us a blemish of less than a tefach in the structure of the altar does not invalidate the entire altar, but that's only as long as one of the actual stones of the altar is not blemished, as long as it's only in the outer coating. So, thank God we have successfully completed the second parak of Maimonides Hilchot Beit Habechira, and practical application for the building of the altar of the Holy Temple, so that we can witness the return of the Shekhinah to the world, the divine presence, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.